The lantern outside Gray's cabin flickered like it was tired of fighting the wind. Winter had not yet arrived, but Montana had a way of pretending early, letting cold fingers slip into the cracks of every home long before the first snow came. Inside, morning moved slow. Elias sat at the small wooden table, nursing coffee that tasted more like regret than anything brewed from beans. His daughter June sat across from him, silently picking at a biscuit that had gone stale overnight. She was 10 now, older in spirit than any child ought to be. Losing her mother had carved years into her eyes. The third chair stayed empty. It had been empty for 14 months. A knock came, soft, hesitant, like someone afraid the door might bite. Elias lifted his head. Strangers didn't come this far up the ridge unless they were lost or desperate. June's gaze met his, wide and alert. The knock came again. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in first. Then the woman standing on the porch. Her dress was worn thin, her shawl patched in places. She held a girl's hand, maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. Dust streaked both their shoes. The woman's chin trembled once, but her voice didn't. "Sir, I'm looking for work. Anything you can spare. Sewing, mending, laundry, cooking. I have a child. We haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Elias felt something twist, low and stubborn, the kind of feeling he'd spent a year trying to bury. He wanted to close the door, not because he lacked mercy, but because mercy meant opening the part of him he'd nailed shut. People brought stories. Stories brought memories. Memories brought pain. "I don't hire help," he said, voice rough from disuse. The woman nodded, swallowing disappointment like she'd done it 100 times before. "I understand, but your chimney," she pointed with a gloved finger. "It's clogged. Smoke's backing into the rafters." "That's dangerous for the girl." Elias blinked. He hadn't expected her to notice, or care. Behind him, June appeared in the doorway. She stared at the little girl. The little girl stared back. Children always recognized their own kind, the ones who carried heavy things, quietly. The woman straightened. "My name's Clara Hale. This is my daughter Rose. We can work for food. Nothing more." For a long moment Elias said nothing. He looked at the dusty road they'd walked, then at the thinness of Rose's arms beneath her dress, then at June, who still hadn't stopped staring at her. One day, he heard himself say, "One day's work. I'll pay in supper." Clara nodded once, relief flickering quick, like a match before wind could blow it out. The gate creaked behind her as she stepped through. It didn't latch properly. It hadn't since the storm last month. She didn't notice. Elias did. June reached for Rose's hand without asking, and led her toward the barn. Clara exhaled, shoulders dropping as if someone finally allowed her to breathe again. Inside, heat from the stove softened the room's chill. Elias poured her a cup of weak coffee. Her hands wrapped around it like she was warming more than just fingers. "You can start with the chimney," he said, not looking at her. Looking felt dangerous. Clara nodded and set to work. By noon she had swept the hearth, unclogged the flue, beaten the rugs, and scrubbed the table until wood grain showed again. Elias kept watching her hands, steady, precise, yet carrying tremors born of hunger and fear. Outside, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the barn. Not loud, not wild, gentle, like something fragile relearning how to exist. June hadn't laughed like that in months. By sundown, Clara had mended 2 torn jackets, patched Elias's work gloves, and fixed a hinge he'd ignored for half a year. She worked like she believed every stitch was a test she might fail. When she prepared to leave, Elias stopped her. "Come back tomorrow," he said. For a moment she froze. "If you'll have us," she whispered. June stepped beside her father. "She fixed the whole house," she said, voice soft but certain. "We should let her come back." Rose stood behind her mother, clutching a small wooden horse June had given her. Elias swallowed. "You'll eat supper with us tomorrow," he said. "Both of you." Clara blinked hard, tears almost escaping. "Sir, I don't want to impose—" "You're not," Elias cut in. She nodded once, held Rose's hand, walked down the path toward town. Lantern lights spilled warm across the dirt as she left. She didn't look back. If she did, she might start hoping. And hoping was dangerous for people who had lost too much. Elias stood in the doorway long after the figures disappeared into dusk. The lantern burned steady, fighting the wind. For the first time in 14 months, the cabin didn't feel like a shrine to grief. It felt like something else. Possibility. The next morning, he woke to a sound he hadn't heard in over a year. Humming. Not his daughter. A woman's voice. Soft. Familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Clara Hale was in his kitchen making coffee. Real coffee. Strong. June sat at the table while Clara braided her hair with gentle fingers, weaving through dark strands the way someone's mother would. Elias's chest tightened. He wasn't ready for this. For warmth. For the memory of how a home used to feel. And yet, June smiled. A real smile. The kind she used to wear before grief made everything quiet. "Morning," Clara said, still braiding. Elias tried to answer, but his throat betrayed him. All he managed was a nod. The day passed in rhythms he had forgotten existed. Work. Shared laughter from the barn. Clara humming as she cleaned. June chatting with Rose like they'd been friends forever. By evening, when Clara began wrapping her shawl, Elias surprised himself. "Stay for supper again tomorrow," he said. Clara froze. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She swallowed hard. "We'll come." He walked her to the gate. She lifted Rose onto her hip, the child already half asleep. Above them, the first stars blinked awake. The gate opened easier tonight. Hinges remembering what motion felt like. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "For supper. For letting us work. For kindness." She hesitated at that last word, like it was one she wasn't used to anymore. Then she walked toward town, disappearing into the quiet night. Inside, Elias lit a second lantern, a thing he hadn't done since his wife died. For a moment the room glowed brighter, shadows shrinking back. June watched the flame flicker. "Papa?" she said softly. "Can Rose come back every day?" Elias looked at his daughter, really looked, and felt something shift in his chest. "If her mama agrees," he replied. June smiled, the kind of smile that healed things. And Elias felt something inside him crack open. Something he thought was long gone. Tomorrow no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something he didn't yet have the courage to name. She came back the next morning, with eyes still carrying the dark rim of a sleepless night. But there was a steadiness to Clara that looked like practice. June had made a small breakfast for Rose. Porridge thin with water, a smear of molasses, and Rose ate it like she had been taught to be grateful for every crumb. The horses stamped in the barn. A rooster somewhere in the valley crowed as if the world would keep its promises. Days became a soft repetition. Chores, bread, mending, lessons learned in the silence between words. Elias taught June to shoe the younger mare. The animal leaned into her like it sensed the place where sorrow had been and wanted to help fill it in. Clara took to the rhythm of the house as if she had done it many times before. She arranged jars on the shelf, sorted threads by color, hummed while she worked. Sometimes she hummed a snippet of a hymn so old the words unrolled like prayer. Sometimes she hummed a folk tune that rolled like laughter. June listened and hummed along. What settled into the newly crowded rooms was not sudden joy, not a healed wound. It was the easier thing, a routine that made life possible. That, more than any grand declaration, was what mattered. In the evenings they ate at one table. In the mornings they split the chores. Rose learned to gather eggs and carry the basket with care. She and June built worlds out of hay in the barn, kingdoms where mothers were not dead and fathers did not know how to stay. Once, as Elias watched them from the loft with a file in his hand, Clara came and stood beside him, her hands dusted with flour. The light struck the dust floating in the air. Their shoulders nearly touched. "You ever think you'd be doing this again?" she asked, voice small. Elias paused. The rasp of metal against wood slowed. "No," he said. Then he added, "because the truth of it needed saying out loud in some way. And yet here we are." She turned to him, and for a moment the world was just two people who had lasted storms. "My husband," she started, then stopped and shook her head. The sentence was heavy with things that could not be carried yet. "He died in a mine collapse," she said finally. They said it was a fault in the shaft. They said it was an accident. Folks said plenty too. Said he should have stopped when he saw the seam give. They said the wrong things. People will believe what's easiest. Elias felt a slower, more patient ache in his chest, listening to her. He had his own confession to make, one that had sat in the dark like a stone. When Martha's fever took her, he had been out on the range, pulling cattle through a snowbank so deep the saddle had become like another limb. He'd come home to a cold house, and a fever's quiet proof. He'd closed the door against the world. With such force he broke part of himself and never fixed it. They did not confess everything to each other in the first month. Confession came later in smaller pieces. A slip of memory, a burned loaf of bread, a laugh that started as a cough and turned into something else entirely. Trust wasn't a torrent, it was a slow seep. News of their arrangement did not stay quiet as the chickens in the yard. Word moved along the ridge and down into town with the speed of people who lived with little to do but take interest in their neighbors' misfortunes and successes. It was noon when Jed Murphy ambled up the drive, boots leaving a thin track in the soft earth. Jed was the sort who measured his days by the number of opinions he could carry. Heard you've got yourself a new hand, he said, as if that described some sudden good bargain at the mercantile. Or a new wife. Elias set aside the rasp slowly. She's a worker, he said. She cooks, she stitches, she minds the girl. Jed smirked. Funny how help turns into more, he said, with the practiced illusion of concern. He tipped his hat. Just looking out for the little ones, eh? Town's had its share of trouble with women bringin' their boys into other folks' houses. Elias felt June go still behind him. June's small fist balled tight, honest anger pulling taut at the edges of her face. Don't you be talking that way in front of my girl, Elias said, and the words sounded heavier than he intended, as if they carried the weight of every unspoken thing he'd ever allowed to fester. Jed's smile thinned. He left with a mutter. Rumors, like seeds, had been planted. They ripened in hot gossip by Sunday. The church folk are the slowest to forgive, not because they are cruel, but because they keep tradition, as if it were a visible thing you could clutch in your hands. Walter Hale, a man with a jaw set like granite and eyes that could miss nothing, said nothing at first. He watched them from the back row, shoulders square. One Sunday, as Clara adjusted June's coat before the service, Walter's wife, Martha Hale, no relation to Elias's late wife, a coincidence of names, leaned past her knitting and whispered, loud enough for those near to hear, "A widow with a lad and a stranger in a widower's home. Doesn't sit right." The knife of that tone did more damage than anything a stranger could have wielded. Clara's fingers tightened on the coat. She managed a small smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Elias felt the heat behind his ears. If he had been the kind of man who could throw down, perhaps he would have met Walter between the barn and the gate. Instead he swallowed and chose a measured calm. One he had learned in the long winter of his grief. Let them watch, he told June that night, in the quiet after supper. Let them watch and cluck. Their opinions don't feed us. It's their mouths. They worry for other people's graves. We worry for the life at our table. June's reply came as a small indignation. But Papa, they don't know what it's like to be hungry. They don't know what it's like to want your mama back until you learn her shape by memory. He held her hand then, and for once his words failed him. He was trying to be brave enough to stand in a place he had never known how to hold before, the place of living, not mourning. But gossip is a kind of contagion that can come with a fever. A letter arrived, unsigned, folded with a certain deliberate crease, left on the stoop in the night. It was smeared where someone had read it and thought better of the shame of it. It said simply that a man who had a good name should not bring a stranger and her child to share a hearth so soon after a wife's grave had still not settled. Clara found it, and her hands trembled when she read the black letters. I should leave, she told Elias that evening, and Rose in the corner pressed her face against her mother's skirt. I cannot be the cause of trouble for you and your girl. I will take Rose, and we will go. I will find another town. Elias did not answer immediately. He watched her jaw work like it was trying to hold back a stream. For a man who had spent months making rules to keep grief tidy, this was the kind of test he had not expected to take. You came here because of the chimney, he said at last, because he had to say something that could not be mistaken for the hollow politeness of fearful men. You stayed because the house needed hands. You're leaving because of their words? Clara's shoulders rose. I have heard those words all my life. They stick like burrs. June, who had learned to be sharp, said, Why should their mouths matter more than Rose's belly? Clara's hands went to the small horse that Rose clung to. I won't be the one who brings scandal down on a child. I've been running most of my life. Maybe running is what I do. You ran to keep from being judged, Elias said, and the sentence came out truer than he meant. You ran because it hurt less than staying. But there are things that are worse than being judged. Clara, there is letting the world decide how we love. She met his eyes then, and it felt like standing on a ridge looking down at a valley. What if they never accept us? She asked. What if June grows up thinking we are wrong for wanting warmth? Then June will know the difference between safe and fearful choices. She will know you stayed and fed her and taught Rose to braid hair. She will know that silence on a porch is not the same as peace. The next week, the town's murmurs turned into something darker when a man at the feed store made an accusation. Quiet, under his breath, about Clara's husband's fault in a mine. That word, fault, spread like a loose shingle. Some folks had never forgiven the dead of any wrong. They must always find someone to blame so their own lives could be less fragile. Clara went quiet. She worked with a kind of mechanical efficiency then, as if by moving her hands she could sort truth from rumor. Rose watched her mother closely. The child had learned to hold her lips tight. Elias tried to shield them, sometimes brave in ways that felt more cowardly than valiant, but shielding can only block so much. One night, after a rain that came like it wanted to wash things clean and did a poor job of it, Clara left a note on the table and walked out the gate. June found the note by the time Elias woke from a restless sleep. The paper was folded in a neat square. It read, I am sorry. I will not bring trouble. I cannot be the reason your house becomes a place of whispers. I am going to find a place where people are kinder. Tell June I am sorry. Elias felt the world narrow to the width of that paper. He saddled a horse with the old familiarity, though his hands had not done that for months. The night sky was a cold black bowl up above, prickled with small, indifferent stars. He rode to the road, followed the prints in the soft mud, and passed the ridge where the lamplight of town lay like spilled gold. And there, 3 miles down, he found Clara and Rose huddled under the eaves of a closed wagon shop, the rain making the world cold enough to sting. Clara's face when he approached was hard with shame. Rose blinked awake and peered at him with hesitant hope. You should not have left, Elias said without preamble. The words were gentle but fierce. She tried to stand to meet him but sagged back as if the night wanted her to stay small. I'm sorry, she said. I left to spare you. You didn't spare us, he said. You left because you were afraid of being seen. I am tired of living in the dark so people don't have the chance to look at me and my daughter and think anything at all. I am tired, Clara. If you leave because someone calls you scapegoat, you will teach June that fear outranks hunger. Something in her broke then. Tears leaked free and slid clean down the lines carved into her cheeks. She had been carrying the world on her own. For so long she forgot the weight could be shared. Hush, Elias said, the word a small instruction and comfort at once. Come home. There is work to be done. There is soup that needs finishing. There are socks that need mending. She laughed then, shaky and surprised at its sound. You, she started. You could have called out sooner, he said. You could have left a note. You could have. I left a note, she cut in. I told you I was going to go. He turned away, the anger he had fought with a month of quiet coming up like wind. You left a note and that was supposed to be enough. She reached for his hand before he could finish the sentence. Her fingers found his and held like they meant to stay. Then stay, she said with simple courage. Elias considered the shape of the night. The weather had worn out. He looked at Rose, who had gone back to sleep and now clutched the wooden horse to her chest as if it could be the thing to keep her steady. He looked at Clara, cheeks wet and brave. We have no choice but to keep going, he said finally. They rode back under the stubborn black of the sky, rain continuing like the steady patience of life. When they reached the cabin, June was waiting on the porch, umbrella forgotten and hair damp. She ran forward like the world had always been this way, the new and the old braided together, in a small, simple act of faith. She flung her arms around Rose and then around Clara, and in the space between the clatter of rain and the steady pull of the porch light, the three of them were a thing that refused to be ashamed. They came inside and ate cold soup and bread. The house smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. Elias watched Clara and felt something less like recovery and more like a careful rebuilding commence. She started making plans, small ones, a winter quilt to mend, seeds to order when the frost loosened, a shelf to repair. But the town did not immediately stop its talking. Men still twisted their mouths and wondered aloud about propriety. Women still clucked behind curtains and measured Clara's worth by how she smiled. Yet there was also a countercurrent of things. The Hale's wife, Martha, had taken to carrying Clara a basket of eggs once a week. Old Mrs. Denny from a farm 2 ridges over had left a jar of preserves on the stoop with no note. Small acts like these are the mortar of communities, the things that hold a house together when the weather tries to pull it apart. One evening, as early snow began to kiss the edges of the fields and the first cold made a thin line of frost on the porch rail, June climbed into Elias's lap and said, "Papa, do you think one can love 2 people at once? Like love one and keep loving the other?" Elias looked at the child, who had learned grief before she had learned to measure sunlight. He thought of Martha's shawl folded in the trunk, of Clara's hands that moved like healing, of nights he'd spent dreaming of nothing at all. The answer seemed too big for words. "Love," he said slowly, "is not a well with a single bucket. It's more like a field. There's room for a lot of things to grow if you take care of it. You don't stop one spring because you planted tulips in another row. You tend both." June nodded solemnly, as if the metaphor made sense. She looked at Clara and Rose, then back at the small lamp on the table, and smiled a smile that did not look like grief pretending to be something else. It looked like a child deciding life was worth the trouble. Outside, the first snow fell in honest flakes. Inside, the lantern burned steady. It was not a triumph, no story like that, had room for simple endings. But it was enough for now. A house alive, voices sharing the small mundane things of living. Hope, like the first crocus in a thaw, was only starting to push through the cold. But it was pushing, which was the work itself. Winter did not arrive in one sweep that year. It crept instead, showing itself in thin sheets of frost on the well bucket, in the way breath lingered long after a person exhaled, in the creaks of the cabin wood settling like old bones remembering aches. The house was warmer now, but not because of the stove. Some warmth is human. Some warmth is earned. Clara moved through the hallway carrying folded linens. Her steps were light, but her shoulders carried a quiet heaviness that hadn't yet learned how to put itself down. Rose helped June bring in kindling, their laughter floating through the door before the cold swallowed the sound. Elias watched them from the barn window, sharpening a tool he didn't really need sharpened. He had never seen June help any child the way she helped Rose. Patient, gentle, as if protecting something fragile she recognized in herself. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. Snow threatened with every gust. "You think the storm will hit tonight?" Clara asked, stepping into the barn. A loose strand of hair had escaped her braid. "Maybe," Elias answered. "We'll know once the smell changes." Clara frowned. "Smell changes?" He nodded. "Storms have a scent, like metal, like something waking." She smiled a little, one of those soft, unconscious smiles that made him feel something inside his ribs. "Wake up," slow and cautious. He didn't know if she noticed the way he stared. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. Sometimes mercy is pretending not to notice what hurts someone to admit. That evening, they ate stew thick with potatoes and the last of the carrots from the root cellar. June and Rose whispered secrets across the table, giggling every now and then. Elias pretended not to watch. Clara ate quietly, eyes drifting every so often to the window where wind pressed against the glass like a restless spirit. After supper, the 2 girls ran to the loft with a lantern to play dress-up with a box of old clothes Martha once used for quilting scraps. That left Elias and Clara at the sink, the room lit with one warm lamp. Clara rinsed plates. Elias dried. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It had texture, shape, weight. It felt like the kind of silence two people share only when trust has begun knitting itself quietly in the background. "You don't have to help with the dishes," Elias said. "You say that every night," Clara replied gently. "And every night I stay." He placed the cloth down, looked at her properly. Really looked. She met his gaze without flinching. "Why did you run that night?" he asked, the question finally making its way out. The real reason. Clara's hands paused under the warm water. A moment passed, a long one, before she spoke. "Because staying terrified me more than leaving." He swallowed. "Why?" She turned off the pump, wiped her hands, and finally faced him. "Because you and June were becoming something I didn't think I deserved." The sentence hit him square, as if someone had swung truth at his chest. Before he could answer, a crash came from the loft and the sound of small feet pounding down the stairs. "Papa!" June shouted, breathless. "Rose fell!" Elias rushed past Clara, taking the steps two at a time. Rose sat on the bottom stair, holding her ankle. Tears streaked down her cheeks. June knelt beside her, face pale with worry. "I didn't mean to push her. She slipped. Papa, I didn't." "Hush," Elias said gently. "Nobody's angry." Clara swept in, kneeling beside her daughter with the kind of practiced fear only a mother carries. "Show me your foot, sweetheart." Rose whimpered but obeyed. The skin was already swelling. Elias lifted the girl in his arms, light as a sack of feed but infinitely more precious. Clara followed close as he kicked open the bedroom door and set Rose on the bed. The storm chose that moment to break. Wind howling, snow whipping across the windows at a slant. The house groaned under the pressure of the cold. But inside, something tightened instead of cracking. Family isn't always born. Sometimes it happens in the middle of a winter storm, on a bed with a child crying softly into her mother's neck. Elias fetched an old strip of cloth, warm water, and a jar of Martha's salve. He handed them to Clara, careful not to touch her fingers too long. "You know what to do?" he asked. She nodded. "I've fixed worse." He didn't ask what worse meant. Some pasts don't need prying open. As Clara wrapped Rose's ankle, the girl clung to her mother's arm, sobbing with tired hiccups. June hovered anxiously at the foot of the bed. When Rose finally calmed, Clara brushed hair from her daughter's forehead and whispered, something Elias couldn't hear, something soft and trembling. He stepped back, giving them space. June moved beside him, small fingers gripping his hand. "Is she going to be okay?" she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Just a sprain." June nodded, relief loosening her shoulders. She leaned into him, comforted in a way she hadn't been since before Martha died. And for a strange, impossible moment, it felt like they were all meant to be here. Together. In this room. Breathing through a storm. Brr. Rose slept in Clara's arms that night, curled close like a kitten seeking warmth. Elias brought extra blankets, piling them on without saying anything. Clara looked up at him once, eyes shining in the lamplight. Not with tears, but with something steadier. Gratitude maybe, or trust, or something he wasn't brave enough to name. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, throat thick. "Call me if she needs anything," he said, and stepped out, closing the door gently. He sat in the hallway for a long while, listening to the storm, listening to the soft murmurs from inside the room, listening to his own heart settle into a rhythm he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Brr. 3 days passed before Rose could walk again, limping but determined. June stayed at her side everywhere she went. On the 4th night, Clara stepped onto the porch after supper, needing air. The cold bit at her cheeks, turning them pink. Elias followed a minute later, boots crunching softly. The stars glimmered through breaks in the clouds, sharp as nails in the black sky. "I haven't thanked you properly," Clara said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting me leave. For fighting harder than I did." He exhaled, breath clouding in the cold. "I didn't fight hard, I just didn't want to lose what was becoming good." She closed her eyes briefly, like the sentence hit her somewhere she hadn't built walls. "You've been good to us," she said. "More than you should have been. I didn't feel like I had a choice." Clara turned toward him. "Why?" "Because June was smiling again," he said simply. "Because the house didn't feel empty. Because you make things warmer." The words surprised even him. She looked away, blinking, not with fear, but with something dangerous, hope trying to gather itself. "Elias, don't say anything," he murmured. "Not tonight. I'm not ready to hear what you'll say, and I don't think you're ready to say it." Clara breathed out slowly, the frost from her lips drifting upward. But she didn't move away. She stood beside him, letting silence be the gentler thing. Sometimes love begins not with declarations, but with two people standing close enough that the cold stops mattering. The next Sunday, Clara insisted on going to church, despite her fear of eyes, whispers, or judgment. "If Rose can walk, so can I," she said. Elias didn't argue. The four of them walked into the pews together. Elias, Clara, June, and Rose. The formation quiet but undeniably family-like. The church fell silent, not cruelly, not kindly, just silent. Walter Hale narrowed his gaze. His wife pinched her lips. A few others watched with unreadable expressions. But some faces softened. Old Mrs. Denny waved Rose over to sit beside her grandchild after service. Mr. Abner, from the tannery, offered Elias a handshake. Two young mothers asked Clara about recipes. Small changes, small mercies, but they mattered. On the walk home, June held Rose's hand. Elias walked beside Clara, close enough their sleeves brushed. When the cabin finally came into view, its chimney letting out a thin thread of smoke into the cold sky, Clara stopped walking. Elias turned. "Something wrong?" Clara's eyes shimmered with a tenderness she tried to hide. "No," she said softly. "Something right." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The warmth in his chest said it for him. Grr. That night, with both girls asleep, Clara stood in the kitchen, fingertips resting lightly on the table. Elias approached quietly. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated. Then, "About what staying means." He swallowed. Hard. "And what does it mean?" he asked. Clara lifted her eyes to his. They were steady, unflinching, brave in a way pain sometimes teaches. "It means I stop running." His heart stumbled in his chest. She stepped closer. One small step that might as well have been a leap. "You stopped running too," she whispered. He didn't deny it. They stood there, inches apart, the lamp flickering warm shadows across the cabin walls. Two people who had lost too much. Two hearts learning, slowly, painfully, beautifully, how to live again. The silence between them grew full. Not empty, not awkward, full. Elias reached carefully, cautiously, and brushed his fingers against Clara's hand. She didn't pull away. She held on. Outside, winter howled against the windows. Inside, something else took root. The beginning of spring. Spring didn't arrive in Montana with flowers first. It arrived with the sound of melting ice. Drip by drip, the world thawed. The field softened. The sky brightened. The wind lost its bite. And inside the gray cabin, something else softened too. Clara woke early each morning, braiding June's hair before chores. Rose learned to ride the gentlest mare. June held the reins steady and whispered instructions. Elias rebuilt the fence posts with stronger wood, Clara handing him nails while their shoulders brushed just long enough to leave his breath unsteady. By April, the house felt like it had always been 4 people instead of 2, like its walls had stretched quietly to fit them. But even spring carried shadows. People didn't stop talking. Rumors didn't stop growing, and hearts didn't stop fearing. Not all at once. One Sunday afternoon after church, Walter Hale approached again, slow, heavy, the way a man walks when he has already prepared his judgment. "Elias," he said sternly, "we're concerned." Clara stiffened. Rose reached for her hand. June stepped closer to Elias like she was guarding him. "Concerned about what?" Elias asked. "Appearances," Hale said. "A widower living under the same roof as a woman, not his wife. 2 children sharing a home. Folks worry what message that sends." Elias inhaled sharply, but his voice stayed even. "What message does it send, Walter?" "That you've forgotten Martha too soon," the elder replied quietly. Clara flinched, as if stabbed in a place only she knew existed. Elias's hands curled into fists. "Don't speak Martha's name to shame the living." Hale blinked, taken aback. "Elias." "No," Elias said. "You don't get to use her memory as a weapon. She loved life too much to want mine frozen forever." The words stunned even Clara. June looked up at her father with wide eyes, like she'd just witnessed something brave. Hale shifted, uncertain. "People will talk." "Let them talk," Elias said. "My daughter smiles again. That's all I care about." He took Clara's hand in front of everyone. Clara gasped softly. Rose's hand tightened around June's, and for the first time in 2 years Elias didn't care who stared. Because the truth settled into him like sunlight. He wasn't grieving anymore. He was living. And Clara was the reason. Walter Hale didn't speak again. He only nodded slowly, gesture of reluctant respect. Then stepped aside as Elias guided Clara and the children toward the wagon. The walk home felt different. Not lighter, just more certain. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Elias stepped onto the porch. The air carried the scent of damp earth, the world giving small hints of green beneath the snowmelt. Clara joined him, pulling her shawl tight. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Not in front of all those people." "Yes," he said softly. "I should have." She looked down at her hands, hands that had stitched, cooked, mended, healed. Hands that had been used for survival more than tenderness. "I don't want to shame your name," she murmured. "You haven't," he said. "You've given it meaning again." She froze, blinked. The wind tugged at her hair. "I don't know how to accept kindness," she confessed. "Every time life softened, it took something from me. Every time I trusted, I lost." Elias stepped closer. "You haven't lost anything here. You don't know that." "I do," he said, voice quiet and certain. "Because I won't let you." Her breath trembled, not from cold, but from breaking and healing at the same time. "Elias," she whispered. He lifted her chin gently, making her meet his eyes. "No more running," he said. "Not from them. Not from us." Clara closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. Elias did. Summer crept in with the scent of pine, and long evenings painted gold across the fields. The ranch flourished, because 4 hands had become 8, and each pair held a different kind of strength. Rose learned to whistle. June learned to laugh without guilt. Clara learned to sleep without keeping one eye open. Elias learned to breathe again. People in town eventually stopped murmuring. Some apologized in quiet ways. Pies left on the porch, seeds gifted for planting, wood offered for winter. Nobody wanted to admit they'd judged too quickly, so they showed it instead. One warm afternoon, Clara sat by the creek washing linens while the girls played in the shallows. Water splashed. Birds sang. The world finally felt wide enough for peace. Elias approached, boots crunching on the river stones. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He knelt, not on both knees, but one, awkward and earnest, as if unsure whether the ground itself approved. Clara's breath caught. He didn't have a ring. Men like him didn't think about rings. They thought about promises. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just for the season. Not because you're tired. Not because the world's been unkind. Stay because we're better with you. Stay because He swallowed. "Because life started again when you walked through my gate." Clara's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled. Rose and June went still, watching from the creek bank with instinctive awe. Children understand without explanation. Elias continued, voice low and firm. "You, Rose, June, me. This is a family. It doesn't matter if the town approves. It doesn't matter what we lost before. What matters is what we choose now." He reached for her hand, not shaking, not hesitant. Steadily. "Choose us, Clara." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I already did," she whispered. He stood and pulled her into his arms. Not a dramatic embrace, not the stuff of fairy tales, just 2 people who had walked through storms and found shelter in each other. The girls cheered, splashing water everywhere. Rose hugged Clara's waist. June hugged Elias's arm. The family they had become closed in around them like warmth. The wedding was small, simple, done under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin. Walter Hale officiated, his voice surprisingly gentle. Martha Hale brought fresh biscuits. Mrs. Denny stitched. Clara a dress of soft cream fabric. June walked beside Clara. Rose held Elias's hand, and when the vows were spoken, the breeze carried the smell of cut grass and pine needles. A blessing. From the land itself. When the sun dipped low and lanterns glowed warm against the growing dusk, Elias looked at his new wife and felt a truth settle deeper than bone. Love wasn't a betrayal. It was survival. And second chances were not gifts. They were choices. He chose her. She chose him. The children chose all of them. And together, they chose life. That night, after the last lantern was blown out and the girls slept peacefully, under one quilt, Elias stood by the doorway, watching Clara brush out her hair. She caught him staring. "What?" she asked softly. "You look like spring," he said. Clara smiled. Small, warm, real. "You look like home," she replied. He walked to her, touched her cheek, leaned his forehead to hers and whispered the truth that finally had a voice. "I thought my story ended the day Martha died. I was wrong." Clara closed her eyes. "So was I." Outside the gate stood open, never locked again. Inside the lamp burned steady. And the house, once a monument to grief, finally exhaled. Not happily ever after, but hopefully ever after, which on the frontier was the only kind of promise that mattered.